Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Grayson with Independent Sector. For those of you who are joining us for the first time on an IS webinar, welcome. Independent Sector is a national membership organization representing a diverse set of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs, working to ensure all people in the US thrive. Today, we will be joined by Wes Coulam with Washington Council Ernst & Young, Jamil Bay with Urban Kind, Heather Noonan with League of American Orchestras, and Michael Roberts with First Nations Institute. As a part of our webinar feature, all lines are currently muted, and we will pause at one point in the program for questions. To ask questions, please type them in the Q&A box or email them to publicpolicy@independentsector.org. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the IS website and emailed to you within 24 hours of this webinar. And as you leave the webinar today, you'll be prompted to take a survey, which we will encourage you to fill out. It helps us better tailor content to meet your needs. And also we're going to be asking you an additional critical question to get feedback on what you think the most important policies are for the sector at this time. So with that, I think I'm excited to get this conversation started. So I would ask my fellow presenters, feel free to allow people to see your faces as we move forward. And let's look at the agenda of what we're covering today. The next slide. Great. So we're going to start with just a very brief federal policy update. And that's just to give everyone a lay of the land as far as what the current environment is, so we can figure out how to plug into that environment to help make sure we're meeting nonprofit needs. Then we're going to do a check-in on what are the nonprofits' needs after the passage of the CARES Act. It was a pretty big piece of legislation, but we all have been in conversation about there's still a lot left to be done to make sure that we can serve our communities adequately. So we just want to have a bit of a conversation with our speakers and even do a poll of our participants to see what needs do you have remaining that need to be addressed. Then we're going to do an overview of the policies for the sector to consider as next steps. And then we're going to ask our speakers to reflect on those policies, what would work for their organizations and their communities, what isn't as helpful. And then we're again going to do a poll of everyone on this webinar and get your input as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to turn it over to Wes Coulam with Washington Council Ernst & Young. And Wes, you're going to give us an update of where are we right now?
Great, thanks, Allison. Yeah, it's a good question. So we've come a little bit of ways down this path reacting to COVID-19. The CARES Act, as we talked about today, occurred in 3 pieces of legislation they've already passed. They passed 2 early pieces of legislation, but the CARES Act really is a monumental and a massive response to COVID-19 to help spending incentives and other tax and other loan incentives to help the economy get back on its feet. As you know, the unemployment numbers have been quite substantial. The government has ordered various parts of the economy to be shut down. And so people are, out of work and trying to get back. When we get back to work. So part of the CARES Act was to help reinvigorate the economy, help spending where it's needed to be, and then also provide incentives in various parts of the economy to get things back going. Part of that was a big spending package. The overall package about $2.2 trillion in spending and in the tax and loan relief. The Congress went back and forth between the House and the Senate, the Democrats, Republicans, and the administration to work on this. It took them a little bit of time to figure it out, but they finally passed the law on March 27th. We're now in the implementation phase of this massive piece of legislation. Spending has started to go out the door on the spending side of things. The tax incentives are starting to kick in for employers, and the loan programs are also starting to just get underway. Not a super quick start, but they're trying to get going on the various procedures and policies of those loan programs on a going forward basis. For example, even today, the Senate tried to expand the Paycheck Protection Act, one of the loan programs for small businesses in the bill. It's really soon to run out of funds potentially The allocation of that was $350 billion in loan amounts, which turned into grants. And they tried to expand that to include another $250 billion in additional funding for that program today. But Senator McConnell put that out there without the Democrats agreeing to it. And so there was some back and forth. We're not able to pass that today. We expect that to be considered and looked at hopefully by next week to expand that program. So that's kind of where we are in the CARES Act. I think that people have been pleased with the size of the program, but I think we still have, we talked about later in the webcast, a little ways to go to make it so it's as helpful as possible to the nonprofit sector and other beneficiaries. And just kind of thinking ahead, we'll talk about it later as well, but they're also definitely looking at a phase 4, another piece of legislation to expand and to build upon the CARES Act and to do additional things on the spending side and also the relief policy tax and loan side. So this is not the last word on this issue. It's obviously a big package, but given the size of the economy and the concerns in the economy and employment, there's more to come from Congress as we look ahead.
Thank you so much, Wes. And I want to respond. There's a couple of questions that are asking about details around what the CARE Act may or may not be able to do for them. And I wanted to remind everybody, Wes and my colleague Ben Kershaw and some other great experts hosted a webinar last week on this topic, and they went into detail about eligibility, which programs are the right fit for different types of nonprofits. And there's that webinar is on our website, as well as a resource page that has a lot of answers to these questions. So I want to make sure people understand that resource is available to you. And this conversation is going to be about what do we do beyond the CARES Act. But in order to do that, we still need to understand what needs are still out there. So I want to turn to our fellow speakers and just do a check-in, because not every, as we heard in our webinar last week, not every nonprofit's needs are exactly the same. Not every community's needs are exactly the same. And that's where we're hearing that there's a lot of room for improvement from the 3 bills that have already been passed. So let's move to our speakers, and we're going to ask them an important question. The next slide. Oh, I apologize. Okay. I forgot before we moved on, and this is a good tag for our website, which is also where you can find the resources, that Independent Sector is a membership organization. These are the kinds of activities that we do on behalf of the entire sector, but we are able to serve the entire sector because we have incredibly generous members. And if you're interested in joining, you can visit independentsector.org/membership. Independentsector.org is also our website where you can find resources on how to access and benefit from the CARES Act. So now we can talk to our speakers. Thank you. And I want to ask everybody, what challenges do your organization and community still face during the pandemic crisis? And I'm not going to call on anybody. I'm going to let you volunteer to step forward and be brave.
I'll jump right in. Hello, I'm Jamil Baif, the Urban Kind Institute in Pittsburgh. Our organization, we work with a lot of small to medium-sized nonprofits who provide social services. And so that's everything from collective impact organizations to coalitions over environmental issues. And a lot of these folks, who provide services, after school programs, feeding programs, programs for meals for seniors, and those sorts of things, as the needs have become they've just expanded tremendously. These folks who are on the front lines doing this work, trying to fit this space prior to the pandemic, are now forced to do that same work under the conditions of social distancing, and when resources are low and depleted. And so it's really a hard-hit group of folks who are, cooking meals in church basements and trying to find ways without PPE protection to deliver meals, to still make sure that people have enough to eat, making sure that people are safe. Our concerns here, in Pittsburgh, where to this point, the social distancing in this part of the state has been effective, and it appears that, we're not going to be hit tremendously hard. But, still folks are dying, and we're at the point now where it's starting to get into some of the nursing homes, and people are worried about what is going to happen. And at the same time, the needs are not going away. And so it's really these frontline people who are really exposing themselves, because, that's the kind of people that they are, just these caring, compassionate people.
Yeah.
But they don't have the resources right now to do a good job. And so that's really the challenge right now, is making sure that folks stay safe and still try to make sure that people are able to have their needs met.
Thank you, Jamil. I think what you recount is probably the experience of a lot of nonprofits out
Right.
there. And it's not enough resources, too much need, and concerned about the health of your staff and volunteers.
Right.
So critical. Let's see, Mike, would you like to share next? Mike, you may be muted. Well, when we find Mike, we're going to ask him this question. Heather, would you like to share it with us?
Yeah, sure. I think I would just echo what was just said about the challenge across nonprofit arts and cultural organizations and our counterparts throughout the sector who we're working in partnership with on the policy front, that they're trying with a completely different set of limited resources to address both the people who work within their organizations. And, in the arts and culture sector, this is a really large workforce of people who might now be supported by an income, as well as supporting the new purpose of their organizations. So we're seeing throughout the arts and culture sector, organizations and individuals turning to new modes online to reach their audiences with the same kind of learning opportunities, performances, presentations, co-creation of new artistic content that reflects the issues of our time, and all trying to navigate this when they have a lot of uncertainty in their day-to-day lives. Maybe to get a little more granular on the policy gaps that are being felt. There was tremendous work done across the sector to ensure the maximum amount of eligibility for the various provisions in the CARE Act. But then we see that translated through guidelines, FAQs, interim rules that somewhat change and narrow the actual access to these provisions. So we find within our sector, at least, that there's a big challenge to keep folks really well informed, which independent sector has done through those resources you mentioned about where the opportunities are. But actually accessing them can be much harder as folks fear the money is running out or the policies don't quite meet up how their organizations operate. And so they're also just searching for far more clarity about where the opportunities are for relief, and also whether attempting to access some of these will either help relieve them or add some new liability that they might not yet understand. So I think what we're hearing across nonprofit groups is a need to just gain clarity as quickly as possible, identify those gaps, and find the policy solutions that address them.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I see, Mike, you have joined us.
I have, thank you.
So we're talking about the challenges that your organizations and communities are facing now. Even though there's been 3 rounds of legislation, there's still a lot of need. So what need are you seeing?
Yeah, so I apologize for losing connectivity there. And I'm guessing that the needs that the communities we work with, the ones they are facing are much similar to the ones that those that Jamil is working with are facing as well. We have, highly impoverished communities without much political awareness, political representation, overcrowded housing, severe pre-existing health conditions, and I guess it's exacerbated a bit in most tribal communities. Their access to federal funds oftentimes come through state agencies, where the federal government disperses those funds through state agencies. And if tribal communities are lucky, some of those funds trickle down into local communities. Though I will have to say that because there's a historic disagreement between tribes and states, mostly over jurisdiction, that tribes aren't often treated well by states for servicing programs. Oftentimes states count underserved populations from the tribal reservations in their counts when they're accessing federal funds, but when those federal funds actually show up in state coffers, the states don't provide those services to the tribal members.
So something that I think we're going to get into a little bit later, and I think, Mike, you will have more to say on this topic. But one of the things we're hearing is the inequalities that existed before the pandemic are just exacerbated as a result of it. And that is taking its toll on organizations trying to serve their communities. Would you agree with that?
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think we're seeing in New Mexico now and in Arizona, in some of the Pueblo communities, and most notably in the Navajo Nation right now, the pandemic sweeping through overcrowded households, households with poor sanitary conditions, folks with little access to healthcare other than government-funded healthcare, which is for Indians funded at half the amount that they fund federal prisoners' healthcare, and things like that. In addition, we're seeing food shortages and the reality of the food deserts that these Indian folks live in, where their nearest grocery stores are 100 miles away, and even then they're kind of mom and pop corner stores, not full-blown grocery stores. You're seeing incredible food shortages in reservation communities right now.
So let's start. I want to get started talking about solutions, but before we do, I want to poll participants on the webinar and allow you to weigh in on sort of what are the biggest challenges facing your organizations at this time. So my colleague Mica, I think, is going to do her best. Oh, great. So take a minute. And while you're voting, I've been receiving a couple of questions. One of them I want to get to a little bit later. It's a part of our webinar, but just as while you're voting, as an FYI, someone had asked about sort of emergency response funding from philanthropy, and is there a list somewhere? I believe that there is a list that's been compiled by the Council on Foundations, and I'm pretty sure we have posted it to the independent sector website as a resource. But if people are not able to find that, again, please email us at publicpolicy@, and we will try to track it down for you. That is a popular question I've had on webinars earlier in the week as well. Okay, Mica, I think people may have had time to vote. Is there a way of displaying the results? Great. Oh, wow. I'm a little surprised that declining giving actually is the top one. I don't know why. We work on this issue a lot at independent sector, but I am. It's very interesting. I see forced to suspend or reduce services is another high one. Let me make sure we're able to see all of these. Great. Okay, so we're going to keep these in mind as we go through the webinar and we start talking about potential policy solutions. So let's talk about the first set of policy solutions. So there are a lot of nonprofits on the Hill who, and if we could go to the next slide. Great. There's a lot of nonprofits on the Hill who are already thinking about next steps. As Wes said, the legislation for the next steps are already in motion. And so there's a coalition of organizations, which includes independent sector, that have already developed sort of an initial agenda that's based on addressing the shortfalls from the CARES Act. And so I'm going to ask Wes, if you could walk us through a couple of these high points of what people are working on right now to try to make issues that may have been addressed in the CARES Act more helpful to nonprofits, or maybe ask federal legislation to go a bit further.
Yeah, sure, Allison. I think these topics kind of align with the survey, right? That people are concerned about reductions in giving, paying their employees while their operations are shut down. So look at the CARES Act provisions in there. They were kind of targeted towards those activities, mainly to help employers, for-profit, non-profit, to keep their employees employed and paying them during this crisis, whether it's through a employee retention tax credits available to nonprofits and for-profits, payroll tax deferral, or the Paycheck Protection Act loan program. We'll get into details on that. So the first piece on your chart kind of goes towards the giving aspect, and so the center was insisted upon putting something in there to help increase giving during this time. As we know, nonprofits are going to be resource constrained, putting a lot of money out the door. They need to help having money coming back in the door to help replenish those accounts to help people on a going forward basis. So the legislation provide a $300 above the line deduction contributions to charitable organizations for non-itemizers. The sector was appreciative of that, but it just doesn't go quite far enough in our view to make a big difference in getting organizations to have their funds replenished. And so the ideas on the table are to, one, raise that limit up substantially. Could include things that go along the lines of legislation that has been introduced in the past from Senator Langford and others to raise it to 4,000 or 8,000 or even higher. Since it's a temporary provision, it shouldn't cost a whole lot of revenue. But also the other provision in there would be to allow it to be taken on your 2019 return. The provision only applies to 2020 gifts on your 2020 return. So the benefits of doing that from a tax perspective don't accrue until next year. The IRS has already delayed people's filing deadline from April 15th to July 15th. And so there's still time to file and still time to give and still time for that benefit to be calculated and received to the taxpayer on their 2019 return. So it'd be great if they could expand that to include on your 2019 return for gifts you make between now and July 15th would be kind of the idea on the table. In addition to that, there's also two loan programs out there. One is called the Paycheck Protection Program. It's through the SBA. It's a loan program that could turn into a forgivable loan program, essentially a grant. If the organization receives that loan and then is able to maintain employment during the 8 weeks after the loan was received, they can turn that into a grant and have that entire loan forgiven. We already heard concerns from the nonprofit sector. They're not able to get those loans as quickly as possible. They feel like they're not getting much attention from their bankers and the lenders right now. The funds, as I mentioned, are going to go fast or are going fast. There is efforts to raise that amount. I think that there's a sense that we really need to have some modification to that program, sort of set aside for nonprofits to have a piece of that loan program. There's also been concern about the way the 500 employee limit cap is applied to nonprofits. And so those that have national organizations and state affiliates are going to be potentially shut out of that program. And so the idea would be to expand that employee limit for nonprofits to higher amounts. There's already higher amounts in there under the SBA rules for different industries, up to 1,500 employees, for example, in the mining industry and the petroleum refinery industry, for example. So we're not asking a lot here, but it would be great to get that increased much higher than 500 employees for the sector as part of this loan program, so they get better access to these funds. There's also another program through Treasury, a larger loan program that Treasury just released with the Federal Reserve for employers that have 500 to 10,000 employees. But that does not have a forgivable feature to it. It's basically a 4-year loan between 2% and 4%. It needs to be paid back. So it's not as generous and not as effective, I think, for the nonprofit sector as the SBA loan program would. So the idea would be to hopefully have that program, as the SBA expanded, to have more nonprofits be able to participate. It can go to the Treasury program, but it's not as generous and as helpful, I think, for the sector as the SBA program. You also have in the legislation expanded unemployment insurance, and there is in there the ability to reimburse nonprofits to self-insure. Most nonprofits usually just instead of paying unemployment insurance, they basically have to reimburse the states for the employees that are on unemployment insurance. And so the expanded bill would be reimbursed, but only 50% of those amounts, those additional amounts would be reimbursed for nonprofit employers. It really should be 100% and get it fully reimbursed for nonprofit employers to be able to keep their employees and help them through this difficult time on unemployment. And the final piece is obviously a funding piece. Like the sector, as we know, is a large part of the economy. About 12% of the workforce is through nonprofit employers. Obviously, the nonprofit sector and charities do a lot of great work around the country. They are going to be, I think, invaluable and important to the recovery of the economy, helping the various communities. And so there is a need, I think, in the case we made, that these programs are some sort of direct funding for the nonprofit sector, either through a spending program or, as I mentioned, through some of these loan programs to expand the set aside for them. So I think that as they look to phase 4, it really would be helpful to have some additional set asides directed towards the sector to help nonprofits on the front lines, to help them in their efforts and their services.
Absolutely.
What's out there, we'll be happy to answer your questions or talk about some more details.
I want to clarify and then ask you a question, Wes. So I know we have on the screen, it says set aside funding specifically for nonprofits. And you mentioned this, technically the loans that exist now, due to our sector's advocacy, are open to nonprofits. So what this is referring to is, now we've heard a lot just within the last week of the loans being open, and in theory, banks accepting applications, that nonprofits are experiencing frustration trying to get their applications submitted to a financial institution. And there's concern that nonprofits in general, and particularly small organizations or organizations that may not have an existing banking relationship, might have a hard time getting into these existing loan systems. So that's what this set aside for nonprofits is trying to get at, is saying, well, maybe we just need to create our own system over on the side, and not try to integrate us quite so much into everybody else's. But Wes, we also received a question from Phil Tabus. Hi, Phil. That he was asking about the Molten bill. So can you speak to that just really quickly?
Yeah, so the Congressman Molten bill would basically expand the charitable deduction out there to increase that amount, to make it unlimited charitable deduction, to make it apply to 2019 tax returns. It would also expand the loan program as well.
I also have a question for Heather. Heather, someone is asking, with the Paycheck loan program through the SBA, was there something in the bill that addresses the need in the arts and culture community, because there's a lot of temporary status of workers?
Yeah, so in the bill for the Paycheck Protection Program, there was eligibility for payroll costs to encompass, at least in our view, and we think the intent of the writers of the bill, both W-2 workers and 1099 workers. In the translation from the statute to the interim guidelines that were released last Friday, the SBA is now saying that 1099 workers are not eligible for payroll costs under the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a real disappointment because very many nonprofit organizations have 1099 workers on their payroll and would like to be the venue through which they sustain payments to those workers for 8 weeks after a loan originates. So it is true that 1099 self-employed workers can file for Paycheck Protection Program coverage directly, but there are some challenges around that. We're finding that organizations themselves need a lot of capacity to understand how to navigate these loan applications. You have a relationship with the lender already in a lot of circumstances. For a lot of individuals, that's just going to be a tall order to accomplish. Also, the banks and the SBA are in effect delaying access to this opportunity for individuals and self-employed workers. So again, that idea of kind of having to go to the back of the line to avail yourself of this relief is a real challenge. So looking ahead on the policy front, our hope would be that both 1099 and W-2 workers get full access to this form of relief.
Thank you, Heather. And I have one more question for Mike. Mike, the CARES Act did include some appropriations to various federal programs that ideally will flow directly into communities, and some of it into nonprofits that are trying to serve their communities. Someone asked, would it be appropriate in future legislation around COVID-19 to ask for funding directly to support tribal communities?
Yeah, no, I mean, there is some specific language in the CARES Act for tribal communities, but in general, legislation needs to explicitly call out tribal communities in the legislation, because when they're not explicitly called out in the legislation, they're oftentimes excluded from appropriations, because the appropriations will go to states and not tribes. So it has to be, it's not an opt-in process. It has to be must be written in process.
That's a really important feature of our policy process to know. Okay, so with that question, we've kind of transitioned to the next point of conversation, which is beyond what is in the sort of current agenda that nonprofits are lobbying around right now. What other policies do we need to be considering? So here's just a list of policies that independent sector we've heard from some other nonprofits, and therefore we're giving serious consideration to it. The first one, actually, independent sector endorsed this policy when we were advocating around the CARES Act, which is asking the federal government to appropriate $2 billion to support a healthy voting system. That means enabling all states to implement absentee ballot voting, early voting, hiring more polling workers to accommodate the early voting, and also providing just training on how to keep clean, healthy polling places, so people don't have to choose between their health and their civil rights. The $2 billion is an estimate of what is needed to comply with CDC recommendations. The estimation was made by the Brennan Center. The CARES Act appropriated $450 million, and so that's why the $1.6 billion is what is remaining as far as what's needed. So the next one is, we've heard from lots of folks, and Jamil, you mentioned this, but securing personal protective equipment and providing training to frontline staff and volunteers. And organizations like the NAACP have this position for all essential employees. And I think with the nonprofit sector, we would agree all essential employees who are working on the front lines need these resources and this information. But as Mike pointed out, sometimes you have to highlight your group specifically, or they may be overlooked. And so the position is advocating to say, but nonprofits also need these resources. The grocery store workers, you might see their association has done a great job advocating for them to get these resources. Another one is increasing volunteer mileage reimbursement rate to make it match the business reimbursement rate. This doesn't sound like an exciting policy, but as nonprofits are changing their service delivery models over to accommodate social distancing, they're relying on volunteers to deliver a lot of services to people in their homes. And so this is a long-standing policy that most organizations in the sector have supported, but right now is an excellent example of why it's an important policy, is we're relying on volunteer drivers now more than ever. And then finally, this last one is sort of a combination of policies across a lot of different organizations. But basically, it comes down to improving the digital infrastructure of civil society. As we social distance, but we still need to help people. We are a sector who loves to bring people together, and we really love to bring people together face to face. And so we're struggling to figure out how to make our service delivery virtual. And so some of the suggestions that have been made so far mirror best practices on the ground in disaster response, which is providing a one-stop for health and human services, so people know where to go if they're seeking information on COVID testing. They know where to go if their childcare center has been shut down, but they are a healthcare worker and need to find stopgap childcare. They need to know where to find this information, and it'd be great to provide just one place where they can go, ask these questions, and be connected with the organizations that are providing these services. And these services exist in people's local communities in a lot of states. It's called a 211 phone system, just like 911. So this request is to make it a national resource and also make it accessible through text and other telecommunications mechanisms. Another proposal is to create a volunteer management one-stop. We were talking with someone yesterday who said, I just want to know where to go so they can tell me what to do. And people are really wanting to help, but they don't know how to get into the system and to respond to needs. So it'd be great to provide people a place where they can go and say, here you go. Here's all the different opportunities. Please find one that suits your talent or your experience or expertise or your physical abilities. Because there's a lot of need out there right now. And this is very similar to volunteer resource centers that are created after natural disasters, but we're gonna create it in a national scale and a virtual platform. And then another one is creating a giving regulation one-stop. So basically this just means a lot of nonprofits, a lot of communities are not being impacted equally across the country when it comes to COVID-19. And if your organization needs to fundraise outside of your community, particularly outside of your state, you have to go to register in other states to fundraise, especially online. And that process has to be done state by state. And so there's this initiative that can be scaled very easily, where you can go to one place, you can register in as many states as you want to fundraise, and you can actually garner more resources into your community in the event of emergency if needed. And then the last one is around bridging digital divide. So if we're going to build this civil society infrastructure, we have to enable people to participate, which means we need to make sure there is not a gap in people who are able to access virtual resources. And we need to make sure all members of our community are able to do so. So let's see, I'm going to look and see if we have any additional questions. Not yet. So I'll pause in just a minute, and I'm going to ask my colleagues if they're noticing any additional questions we need to answer. Please feel free to send them on. But in the meantime, I also wanted to flag some outstanding questions. So we just reviewed some of the policies that are already under consideration, but there's still a lot of questions, at least in the independent sector, that we have, and questions we've heard from other parts of the nonprofit community. The first one is, how do we make sure nonprofits do not merely survive the crisis, but build sustainable, equitable communities? Is this an opportunity to change systems rather than shore up the current one? And I'm going to butcher this, but I read a great quote by Jan Masaoka, who's the CEO of Cal Nonprofits, where she said, inequality is driving the coronavirus in terms of how bad it is and which communities are being impacted. And then the coronavirus is then further perpetuating inequality. So if inequitable systems are working hand in hand to exacerbate this public health crisis, is this an opportunity to correct those systems as we are trying to find a way forward? Is, I think, a really important question that we don't know the answer to yet, but we want to continue to ask it in these forums in hopes that conversations with members of the sector can help us identify policy solutions that we can advance. Another one is, to what extent do nonprofits need help figuring out how to transition to virtual business models to implement CARES Act and other relief efforts? Jamil, I think you mentioned this earlier. I feel like we're hearing this a lot, and it's something that I think organizations are figuring out on the fly. But as we hear about best practices, we're going to, independent sector plans on hosting more events like this to try to share what is working for organizations so we can find a way forward. And then last but definitely not least, what is the role of nonprofits in ensuring culturally appropriate COVID-19 response Do nonprofits that help in this area have a unique set of needs that should be addressed in future legislation? And I think this gets to, again, Mike, your point about, is it necessary to call out legislation assistance for some communities to make sure that they are getting what they need? And this is a question I think that applies across the board. And one we want to make sure we're asking at a fairly regular interval when we're having these policy conversations. So I did see some questions come in. So can the PPP contract employees cannot be protected and can try to get the loan themselves, yes or no? I believe that's what that's asking. So contract employees can apply for themselves for the loan. I think what Heather was mentioning is, though, they are not being prioritized by the banks. And so a lot of employees feel like they are at the back of the line. And that's similar to how a lot of nonprofits feel at this moment in time, which is why we are questioning whether or not, you know, there needs to be future legislation that is set aside. Contractors, let's see, payroll services to pay contractors and produce 1099s can be included. Oh, okay. This is saying that their network is confused.
So if I could jump in, Allison.
Please, Heather, as I'm butchering the question.
No, I mean, these are exactly the right questions to be asking. And there's a reason the questions are confused. It's because the guidelines are kind of contradicting some of the statute in some ways, but also lenders in the rush to implement the program, some lenders also gave applicants varying answers to these questions as well. And, you know, obviously I'd always invite Wes to comment on the fine print, but the guidance from the IRS basically did say that an eligible payroll cost does not include, from an organization applying, would not include their 1099 workers. And one of the reasons they said that was the case is because, in fact, those workers could apply independently for this kind of relief. At the same time, they announced that it would be an April 10th start date for independent contractors to submit those applications. Meanwhile, there's a rush to the banks, right, to get this in the door. The other thing I'd just say about self-employed workers, who, you know, the gig economy is made up of actually a lot of nonprofit gig economy workers all across the spectrum. The other form of relief that they're now eligible for would be state unemployment benefits. So one of the challenges with that is states are necessarily slow to roll out that opportunity because they don't have systems built for self-employed workers to claim unemployment benefits. So now you've got this huge part of our nonprofit workforce that's kind of in a holding pattern. And meanwhile, they've really fundamentally lost all sources of income. So I think it's really helpful for all of us as we collect and tell the stories of the gap and where the needs are made, that we just keep in mind that part of our workforce as well.
Absolutely, and I think the example of gig economy workers and the expansion of unemployment benefits also is a great example of this first bullet about changing systems. There's a great article in Nonprofit Quarterly about how this is creating an opportunity to advance policies that people have advocated for a long time. And now we get a chance to pilot them. And so for a long time, people have talked about the need for contractors and gig economy workers to be able to qualify for unemployment insurance. We've advocated for a long time for the need for non-itemizers to be able to claim a charitable deduction. So there are, there's even some people could argue there was a universal basic income type provision in the CARES Act. So there are also questions about how can we use this as a window of opportunity to look at these bigger systems and maybe experiment with things that we were advocating for as policy solutions all along. So with that, I want to stop for a minute and give, I know I've been asking everybody questions as we've gone along, but I want to give our speakers a chance to respond. So if we can go to, I believe, our first question for everyone, the next slide. So of the public policies we've just discussed, to what extent will any of these meet the needs of your organization, network, or community? And I'm going to start with you, Jamil, because I haven't picked on you in a few minutes.
And it looks like I'm antsy and ready to jump in. I was just scrolling through some of the comments and questions here, and it's just reminded me, if we're thinking about the way that we need to address this, we have to go back to what Mikey was saying, and we really have to be specific about the targets of the ask. And, so just an example, one of the ones, what does a Muslim organization do if they need to make a loan and they have that restriction of interest? If we don't address that, it won't be addressed. If we don't talk about First Nations specifically, then they won't be addressed. I was in a conversation earlier today and, with some medical folks, and they were saying that this has accelerated our adoption of telemedicine, that we're not going back to regular hospital visits. What does that mean when seniors need to, who don't have access to quality Wi-Fi or smartphone use, how do they get the care that they need? And if we're not specific about addressing these needs, then we're going to get this one size fits all. And that means that the organizations that have, lobbyists and staff and solicitors are able to get those needs met, where these small organizations who are, doing this really nuanced work are going to miss it. So we really need to make sure that we're being inclusive in this ask and thinking about what are those specific needs. And now's not the time to be general. Just don't be selfish. What is it that you need right now? And speak up.
I love it. Thank you. I think we're going to put that on it.
Be selfish.
Absolutely. And we've actually heard that from the Hill at this point in time. So this is excellent advice. Mike or Heather?
Jump in on the charitable deduction policy recommendation. I mean, I think that, for a sector that loves regulation, the foundation and not-for-profit sector shies away from regulation on foundation giving. I know, back in the early 2000s, there was attempts in California and other places to get foundations to essentially take this publicly supported money in their tax deductions and be more equitable for people of color, reporting statistics on boards and giving from their portfolios. And there's a huge resistance by the foundation community to kill these kinds of bills. And as a result, we see the same inequities in giving by foundations that we've seen for the last 20 or 50 years, that folks like my community, 23/100% of foundation giving gets to Indian communities. So, I would guess that if there was more equitable regulation on the foundation industry itself, there would be an increase in that kind of giving.
Thanks, Mike. I will say when it comes to regulation oversight related to giving, that those are topics that come up pretty regularly in conversations with policymakers. So this is a concern that they also share, and the sector may need to make sure we have a defined position on going forward. Heather.
Yeah, so two thoughts. One kind of connects up to the inequity in access to youth development. So typically we would be heading at this time of year into high intensity programmatic delivery for kids during summer months, right? Planning, registering kids for this stuff, getting them access to the tools they'll need to continue their education, and also enrichment over the summer. In terms of infrastructure and digital divides, we know that any offerings will really have to be primarily delivered online. So being able to pay attention to how our sector helps to level the playing field for kids to have access to those enrichment opportunities and educational opportunities they really depend upon, I think is a really important point of focus. To the degree there's any increased federal investment and giving students access to year-round learning, the nonprofit sector is deeply involved in partnering with public schools to deliver that historically. We should be at the ready and also well-funded to be involved in that, and I think the weeks and months ahead. And we should certainly see in the arts and culture sector that groups are really reimagining how they deliver on mission in that way. Another thought that maybe moves into solutions beyond the ones we've been discussing so far is also just anticipating when we get to the recovery phase of this. there will be a changed way of doing things. I think that the example of telemedicine visits is a good one that will apply to many other ways that we typically experience life that will just be different in the future. And that nonprofits may need some infrastructure help to become spaces where people feel safe entering when they do gather again. And then also as our sector thinks about reprogramming and presenting the works that they do for communities, they rely heavily on international activity to carry that out, international person-to-person activity. And we'll be watching really closely where the opportunities are to make sure that US visa and immigration policies really support the breadth of people-to-people work that we hope will come back to life soon.
Thank you, Heather. And you've transitioned into our second question. I think Mike also gave some ideas about what else other than the policies we've discussed so far are needed. But I want to give maybe Jamil and anybody else an opportunity to add in one final word about if there's other policies that you would see the nonprofit sector as a whole get behind in order to respond to needs that you're observing. What else would that be? We've covered them all. Okay. Well, I do want to transition then really quickly. We want to ask these same questions of the participants on the webinar. So if you could, we're going to put up another set of 2 polls. The first poll is what policies that are currently on the sector-wide agenda help meet the needs of your organization, and you can check all that apply. So we'll take just a moment and allow you to read through those. Okay, Mica, let's see if we can view the results. Requires SBA to set aside loans for nonprofits, which is where a lot of the attention and energy has been so far. So it's good affirmation that efforts are in the right place. But it's interesting to see increased direct government funding to specific programs it looks like the second highest. Really great responses. Okay, Mica, can we do the second poll, please? Well, it may not be working. So the additional polls, we wanted to ask, what are the other policies, both the ones that we discussed today, additional policies, or even ones we didn't discuss, that you would like to see or you think that we need to be considering going forward? We will have a survey at the end of this webinar to ask how well it went for you, but we've added an additional question. So if you have ideas on the kinds of policies that you think we should be working on, and they are not currently on the agenda that Wes discussed, we want to hear about that from you. So with that, I want to begin wrapping up this webinar. And first and foremost, I want to thank Jamil, Heather, and Mike for being so generous with your time and your expertise, and Wes. I'd never want to overlook Wes. And I want to mention next week we will have just a very typical policy update and town hall on COVID-19 response. And we're reserving the space because action is developing in the legislative space, and it changes every single day. And so we want to have a space where we can all come and talk about what has happened, what a new guidance has come out about current policy, what are the windows in order to advance new policy, and maybe we can start aligning behind a strategy and issues that work for the sector as a whole. In order to register for that, you can visit independentsector.org/events. And then I also want to just flag, We have our resource page, which is independentsector.org/COVID-19. This is where we have all of the CARES Act summaries. We have FAQ pages about CARES Act and how to access it. But we also have a survey tool that asks, what else do you need? And we want to hear from you because we're trying to create programming that will help you. And it can be policy related, but it doesn't have to be. And we'd really like to hear what information and what experts do you want to hear from. So with that, I will say thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And we look forward to talking to you next week. Goodbye.